to I-24 News correspondent Jonathan Sacerdoti. Jonathan, part of the conversation that we're having here in studio is about how welcoming the people of Europe will still be to migrants coming into their countries. Have you had a chance to speak to anybody there on the streets about not only the Muslims already living there, but the ones who are coming in and how they may be welcomed after such attacks?
Well, that news that we heard yesterday, that one of the attackers was reported to have gone through Greece, potentially as a refugee, and that's their entryway into Europe, will of course put a new spin on how people feel about the idea of immigrants coming from Syria or elsewhere in the Middle East into Europe, because many of these people don't have documentation, the authorities don't know who they are, and while there is a humanitarian need, it's clear also that Daesh, ISIS, can take advantage of this sort of thing and send in terrorists. We've also recently heard reports that one of the attackers may have been a woman, and yesterday we heard also that one of them was 15 years old. So we're really seeing a new kind of terrorism hitting Europe here, which might involve children, women, which might involve abuse of the migrant crisis and the kindness of Europe in accepting these sorts of refugees. So all of these things are in the mix, and really we're seeing, I think, a perfect storm, a coming together of so many elements of the news at the moment regarding Europe and the Middle East and how the two meet.
And Jonathan, can you describe the feeling and the scene in the streets of Paris? They seem somewhat empty, with mostly the people walking around being the extra security forces that were deployed.
Well, oddly enough, as I was walking around on the streets last night, just talking to people and seeing how the city was, taking the temperature, if you will, I have to say I noticed very few police and very few military personnel on the streets. Sure enough, here and there you do see them, but it's notable that there isn't a lot of that. And as you were discussing just there in the studio, Paris is in fact a city that is very unregulated with cameras. There are not many cameras around compared to somewhere like London, where most movements that you make in public are filmed somehow through some sort of security. It's not the case here, and the French are very keen on their personal freedoms and privacy. So this is obviously an equation that Europe is also going to have to rebalance. In order to protect people's security, there may be a need to give up some of their personal privacy.
And I find it very interesting that you're saying that you didn't see that many security forces out in the streets last night. Is that something that the French people have been maybe upset about? Do they feel comfortable enough already to walk around without people there to protect them?
Well, one man I was speaking to last night pointed it out to me, and he was furious. He said that he didn't feel the government was doing enough to protect the people of France and the people of Paris. He said that a few years ago you would have seen police on the street routinely, but now he said there are fewer of them, and even after this sort of attack, he said, he found it peculiar that there weren't more people around. So it's a matter of balancing whether or not you want a constant security force around a city which will make people feel safe but also potentially slightly at risk, or whether or not you want to preserve the freedoms but open yourself up to the risk of horrific incidents like these taking place. And of course the porous borders of France and Europe are to play here as well. When we hear that some of the attackers and their teams were arrested in Belgium, and that potentially there are some reports now coming in from French media that there are still some on the loose in Belgium who are being searched for, we understand that really Europe has a problem on its hands when it can't know who's coming in and out as easily as it needs to, when it can't know what weapons are coming in and out as easily as it needs to, and when it has a population that is somewhat resistant to extra security, which could potentially save them from these sorts of events happening in the future.
And even now, as you hear people upset that there isn't additional security in the streets, it was just 10 months ago the Charlie Hebdo and the Hyper happened, and we saw added security. Now again, an even deadlier attack in just 36 hours there. As you're saying, the streets are somewhat clear of security forces, and that big question remains whether or not people will demand their civil liberties over their security. Jonathan Sacerdoti joining us throughout this morning. Thank you very much.